Hello everyone, welcome back to a new video. Today we're going to be having a look at the latest released balance proposals. So this is not a definitive balance update, but these are proposals they do, and then we got to test them out. And some of the pro players get emails, and we got to respond to those emails and say, hey, what do we think of these changes? So I figure I make a quick video going over all of the changes, their reasoning, see if there's any faults in their reasoning or if a lot of it's based on logic, and then just my overall thoughts on the patch and the current state of the game. I'm just gonna read through it, their reasoning, and then we'll get to the changes eventually. Hey all, with the recent celebration of the 10th anniversary of our beloved game, the conclusion of DreamHack Master Summer, and the imminent final of GSL Season 2, we'd like to take this time to update you all on our thoughts on the state of the game since our last balance patch. As we haven't seen many changes in TVT and ZVZ, we'll be focusing on talking about the other matchups. Start with TVZ. Though we had some concerns regarding the matchup going into the current patch, the changes to Zerg seem to have been offset by changes in the map pool. Currently, we feel TVZ is very diverse and dynamic, with possibly the highest number of strategies being employed from both sides in the matchup ever. Specifically, we'd like to call out the rising popularity of mech, transitions from battlecruisers into bio, and general lurker play. Overall, we're excited to see this matchup develop. Now, the transitions from battlecruiser into bio, I think, are still pretty rare. They were a lot more common 4 or 5 months ago. I think I've seen 2 or 3 games of them recently. They have worked, but I think still most Zergs and Terrans consider that opening quite weak. So I think it's a bit odd they mentioned that specifically, but I guess it is getting more popular. Lurker play is mainly Raynor playing it. Raynor is probably the best CVT player in the world right now, and he's been playing a lot of the big Lurker styles. Very, very aggressive, very fun to watch. Mech has been getting more popular, so far everything seems pretty fair. The matchup feels dynamic and very, very diverse. I think TVZ is actually in one of the best places, both balance and game design wise, that has been in a long time. There's so many different styles that both Zerg and Terran can employ. It seems kind of fun. Alright, move on to TVP. A lot of trends we've noticed, and much of the feedback we've received on this matchup focus on the early game. Early tank pushes have become less powerful and less common due to battery overcharge. Yeah, that seems true. Widowmine drops with a fast armory is a new opening that has popped up with mixed success. I think this was written the August of 6, probably a bit before. We don't really see a lot of fast armory builds anymore in the past 2 weeks, I want to say. I think there was something just after the armory giving mines indefinite cloak. I feel like at the start a lot of people were experimenting. Now we're seeing it a lot less already. Hellion openers, like they mentioned here earlier in the patch cycle, Hellion-based openers saw both rise in popularity and success. I think that's true. Hellion openers are very, very popular with proxy starports, with regular starports, from regular barracks, from proxy barracks. Basically, lots of Hellion drops, lots of Hellion play. I mean, if you watch Parting versus DY in the GSL, for example, lots of Hellion play. So I think they're pretty spot on with that. We believe it's due to a combination of how commonly Protoss players rely on certain variations of Blink and recent changes to the map pool. I'm not quite sure about the changes in the map pool that they're referring to in this case. I do think that Blink openers are generally quite weak against Hellion openers, simply because you need to get 2 tech structures before you can add your extra gateways, meaning especially against proxy starport stuff, it's going to be very difficult to have more than 3 units in position against potentially a 4 Hellion drop. So what we're seeing as a response to this is we see still Blink being employed a lot, but we're seeing Blink into faster Robo Bay, so skipping the 3rd base for another minute, sometimes even a minute and a half, allowing for those faster gateways in the base and just a lot safer openings, meaning that TOS also gets a lot less eco. So there is some downside there if you play against very greedy Terrans, but this is the most common trend that we've seen starting in Korea, as always. Almost all PVT changes almost always come from Korea. PVT is absolutely at the highest level there, which for some matchups you could see that the Zergs in Europe have figured some things out a bit better, but for PVT, definitely, if you want to be looking at metagame changes, you're always going to be looking at Korea. Where was I? Blink openers, blah, 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 blah. Though there's some contention on this topic, our current belief is that given an even early game, the rest of the game also feels even. There's a lot of both races can do to impact the outcome of the match. Overall, this is another matchup that we think mostly needs some time to breathe and develop. Okay, I agree that balance-wise, the game feels probably relatively even, and both races can do a lot to impact the outcome of the match. I think a lot of the time you'll see the better player win. I also think that TVP is one of the matchups currently, which is very, very boring in the early game. Not so much the first 4 minutes, but the part after 4 minutes. So we see Terran do an opener, whether that be a mine drop, a Hellion drop, or even like a very passive opener. A lot of the time afterwards, we see Terran go into fast triple CC, and then lately, a lot of Terrans have started adding a lot of tanks. And basically they just turtle till they get fort base. So there's a period of 4 or 5 minutes in the game where very, very little happens. The tanks basically deny any type of pressure from Protoss from happening. You can't really walk into tanks unless you got a big lead in the early game. Multitasking against this is pretty much impossible. It's really easy for Terran to deal with multitask because they have boost medevac. So as long as Terran stays at home, it's very, very difficult to kill them. There's not a lot of things that TOS can do in that case. And on the other side, if Terran tries to move out a lot of the time, they just kind of die if they didn't have a way better early game, and they go into 3cc afterwards. And the fast 3cc follow-up seems to be very popular right now, especially with Raven stuff as well. So I'm a little bit afraid that the longer we're going to be giving this matchup to breathe and develop, usually the longer a matchup has gotten time to develop, the more passive play we see. And I already feel like the matchup is very passive as is. And I feel like that needs to change from both sides. So perhaps something can be done there. That's not balanced, but just purely matchup design-wise. It might be something we could want to have a look at. I'm not quite sure what exactly, but it's something that has been bothering me a little bit. All right, let's move on with PvP. Introduction of battery overcharge. PvP has seen an extreme shake-up since the last patch. It seems to be developing week by week, and no player we reached out to believes they fully understand it yet. I agree. However, we'd like to discuss what we've been seeing in the matchup recently, phase by phase. In the early game, we've seen the introduction of brand new openings such as 1 Gate Fast Expand and Nexus First. While some players find these new openings interesting and exciting to play with, others dislike the increase of potential viable builds could increase the impact of build order advantages. Yeah, it is. I mean, it is what it is. You get more openers. Some counters the other more, but I think it's not that hard in PvP currently to play safe in the early game. The battery overcharge helps a lot with that. It increased the viability of a lot of builds in the early game, which is extremely nice. So I'm not one of the guys that finds it that dislike the increase of potential viable builds. But it is a good point that they raise 1 Gate Fast Expand, especially on maps like Golden Wall. Pillars of Gold has become very viable. Nexus First I've seen on Eternal. I've seen on Death Aura as well. I think Drogo played against Showtime in the most recent DreamHack Summer. I've seen Astrea played a little bit as well. I know Neeb is fond of it. So I haven't seen it much in Korea, even though I know that they play something like that on Pillars of Gold, a quick 1 Gate Expand. I've seen Stats experiment with it. So as for proxy robotics, which was the main thing that the battery overcharge was meant to deal with, we've seen the decrease in uses of this strategy. There's no clear consensus for exactly how much battery overcharge helps in the defense. While it certainly helps to some degree, the most common feedback we hear is that it's not really a make or break ability for this purpose. Because our original intention was not necessarily to completely stamp out this build entirely, and feedback is still developing on this issue, we're going to keep an eye on it in the future. So I like this a lot. I agree with them. The build is still viable. It's gotten worse because there's just a lot more build orders now in the early game that are better against proxy robo. Because of the battery overcharge. It doesn't necessarily hard counter them, but it's just a lot easier to stay alive. It's kind of difficult to die against proxy robo at this point. As long as you can cancel your natural, majority of the time you're pretty much going to be fine. There's a lot of counterplay. We don't see it a lot. We see it a fair amount. I think that's completely fair. I think it's a fair summarization of my thoughts. Moving on to the mid game, we've been seeing a lot more blink builds, which we attribute to the defensiveness that battery overcharge can provide on 2 and 3 bases. In addition, battery overcharge seems to have been very successful in discouraging the 3-base Archon Immortal Zealot alliance that we have typically seen ending games in the past. This is the most important thing. This, I think, was the biggest issue in StarCraft in quite a while. Well, at least for me, because I play Protoss. This was very annoying. It felt like that the early game was, once you got behind even 2 or 3 probes, you were just going to get A-moved in the mid game by Archon Immortal Zealot. That's not the case anymore. There's still some timings that are hard to deal with, mostly kind of focused around Blink Stalker timings, but we don't see a lot of the Archon Immortal Zealot all-ins anymore. Robo openers are, I think, inferior to Blink builds because it's harder to take a quick third base without opening yourself up to a lot of harass from the Blink player, meaning that Blink almost always gets an economical advantage. Against Robo openers, you can then go into charge, fast 8 gates, 50th probes, and with the battery overcharge, almost always will be able to survive. This brings us to the late game. Because of how mid games now typically play out, 4-base plus PvP seems to be much more common lately, with Stalker, Disruptor, Carrier's Tempest, and Blink Dark Templar all making regular appearances. If you would have told me this just a month and a half ago, I would have been the happiest man alive. It's completely true. We see a lot of late game Stalker Disruptor, which is very, very fun, very skill based. Blink Dark Templar are a big part of the matchup in the late game as well once you get to 4+ bases. And we've been regularly seeing some of the most epic PvPs ever played. It really feels this matchup has been blown wide open. Completely correct. There is some words that, or some things that do irk me a bit, is that there is some passive phases, usually while people are either transitioning into Disruptor. The battery overcharge, if armies are even, just don't really allow any type of active play from either player most of the time, which is a little bit annoying. Blink shuts down drops very well as well. So basically any type of aggression, similar to PvT, it's difficult to have mid-game aggression before both players kind of have the army that they want and before they need to take a fourth base. So that's something just to keep in mind. Once again, usually the further a matchup develops, the less aggressive the matchup becomes. So if you think something is passive close after a patch, it usually gets more passive over time. It's something you do need to keep an eye on. With a few exceptions, the feedback we've received on the change made the CVP matchup in the last patch indicate that they've been helpful. That is, the change to Queen range has been noticeable. That's very noticeable with oracles. The energy cost change, the revelation allowed to be an effective creep clearing tool. I don't really use oracles that way. I don't think a lot of people use oracles in the way that they're for just the creep clearing. I don't think it's that common, honestly. The increased range for feedback has been significant in late game interactions. Also true. The +1 range really does help against Infestors and Vipers. Battery overcharge is shown to be a powerful defensive tool, especially when it was first released and Zergs were not yet used to its potency. It's funny actually, I feel like battery overcharge is actually stronger when defending a fourth base than it is defending a third base. Because usually when you have a fourth base, you have a big enough army to defend the battery. But when you have a third base, usually you only have like 2-3 immortals and it's like a roach in and just bile down your battery. So you really need to be very careful where you put it. But I do agree that it's a very potent tool at defending. On the flip side, Revelation's lower duration, while not a game breaker, does impact its use in late game. We've also received mixed feedback from players as to the impact of the Baneling damage changes in the last patch. While many have told us that these changes have gone mostly unnoticed, some players note that they've seen an uptick in Stalker Robobay compositions, partially due to this change, especially from Korean Protosses. I think it's incorrect that it has to do with this change. I think it had to do with people realizing that playing Storm after Glaives is not as good as we initially thought. I've been very wrong in that as well. I really thought Storm was the best transition, but it seems like Stalker Colossus is just way more natural. Playing from Glaives opener. I don't think this change had much to do with it. I think they get that wrong, the reasoning. But I could be wrong as well, of course. Like they have a larger body of people than they speak with than I do on a daily basis when it comes to this kind of stuff. Ultimately, though, the last patch has not produced the lasting impact to ZVP win rates that we had hoped, and most of the feedback we currently receive about this matchup from professional level Protoss players remains similar to what we had received before, just to a slightly lesser degree. For reference, the majority of this feedback relates to the following: the efficiency of the Baneling, both as a combat unit and in a harassment role, the inability of clearing creep without necessitating the presence of the entire Protoss army. For 2, I still agree. With 1, I think Baneling is extremely effective in its harassment role, but as a combat unit it lost a lot of its power, or at least it feels that way, even against stuff like Archons. I noticed with the styles that I've been playing, I find it a lot easier to fight Zerg armies. So yeah, I'm not finding myself completely in that feedback here, but I know a lot of my Protoss brothers do, so I don't want to stick a knife in their back, but I don't agree too much with the first line, at least with the combat unit part. Based on all this feedback, we are led to believe that while we're heading in the right direction with our changes, perhaps we had not gone far enough. In addition, we'd like to address the community's current stance on ZVP late game. Our perspective is that the community at large currently believes that ZVP is heavily Zerg favored in late game. The community does believe that. On this topic, what we hear from many top Protoss players is that the late game unit interactions between the two races are not inherently lopsided, especially after changes to feedback. In fact, there are players from both sides who believe it is Protoss favored. Yeah, I could agree with that. There is just some notes that you want to make with when you talk about late game PvZ. I'll get to it once I end this. Rather, there's an agreement that the primary problem with late game is the difficulty of getting on equal footing with the Zerg. Especially in the face of constant harassment, the power of defensive banelings on creep, and general unfettered creep spread, as Protoss often feel like they have to choose between expanding and pressuring. Our thoughts on this feedback is twofold. First, the most impactful changes we attempt to make in this matchup should focus on mid-game. That makes sense. If all this logic checks out, this is sound. And second, while there might be room to adjust a few things in late game, we should do so with a focus on improving how typical late games play out. From a design standpoint, while we're sure we can increase Protoss win rates by granting Protoss additional strict raw late game power, we don't think this would lead to particularly desirable gameplay, as it might further encourage the stalemates and turtling that we've historically seen in the matchup. Rather, the direction we like to take is to grant Protoss additional tools that encourage interactivity from both sides. Without further ado, here are some changes we'll be featuring in the next balance decimal. So, about this part with the late game, I think one of the most important things when it comes to late game is that whenever TOS can get into a good late game against the Zerg, 99% of the time you're going to be able to kill the Zerg before they get to late game. If you're in a position where you look at your situation in the game and you go, hey, I think it's possible for me to play a winning late game, then 99% of the time you can look at your position and be like, hey, I think it's possible for me to kill my opponent in the next 3 minutes. And then it makes no sense to go into a late game where if you just attack, you mostly win. And if you go into a late game, you know, there might be a 70% you win. So you're just losing a 25 to 30% because you're trying to get into the late game. So even though then we'd probably see more Protoss win in late game, it wouldn't make a lot of sense for Protoss to go there. If you're already so far ahead that you can get a kill, then you can also get into a good late game. I think that is the one thing that they kind of miss here, where I feel like that's quite important to note. I feel like a lot of the time that just kind of happens. And also something there is, of course, that a lot of the time we see Zergs get into a late game, it is because the Protoss couldn't kill them. And then almost automatically the Zerg is going to be ahead going into the late game, which is kind of what they're referring to here. So if you want to change the statistics then, or if you want to get win rates closer in Protoss favor, dealing with the mid game, I guess, is kind of fair. So the first change that they propose is a weapon damage change from 18 plus 17 versus light to 15 plus 20 versus light, meaning Banelings just do less damage against units that aren't light, but do the same amount of damage versus units that are light. Archons, Immortals, Tanks, Thors, all will have more longevity in that case, which I think is pushing it perhaps a bit too far, but it's hard to say. It's annoying because I feel very good in the matchup currently, so it feels weird to say I think we need this. Well, I don't think it's necessary. I think if TOS plays very well, you have a very good chance against the Zerg currently. So I don't think it's a necessary change. But like I said, a lot of other Protoss players feel that this is very necessary. Some of the Zergs might feel this is necessary, even though they'll never say it in the open. This is the one thing about the Zergs, guys. They're sneaky. They're a sneaky bunch. Oracle. So for Protoss, yeah, not a big fan of this change. Oracle, Revelation duration increased from 15 seconds to 20 seconds. Our aim with this change is to increase Revelation's endgame usability without making it too easy to continuously tag enemies in mid-game. We considered a few options to accomplish this, but in the end found this tweak the cleanest solution. I don't think it's necessary either. It's nice, but it's not really necessary. I think it does a fine job in the late game. 15 seconds is a lot of time to see the complete movement of a unit. I think it also would be too strong against Terran, adding the 5 seconds. It also would need to increase the cooldown with it, I think, to make the spammability a little less. Void Ray, that is the interesting one that you guys will definitely care about. It's a bit less interesting for me. Cost decrease from 250, 150 to 200, 150. Void Ray build time decreased from 4 33 to 37 seconds, and movement speed increased from 3.5 to 3.85. As the Void Ray is one of the least commonly used unit in our game, for good reason, we thought now would be a great time to grant it at a niche that lines up with what Protoss struggle with at the moment. The niche we had in mind in PvZ was that of a multi-purpose mid-game unit with the ability to clear overlords, zone out and or clear creep, and deter baneling drops. As the primary feedback we get about the Void Ray is that it's simply not efficient. Our first step was to lower both its resource and build time cost. In addition, we believe it needs a slight mobility boost in order to fulfill this role, so we'll be increasing its movement speed to match that of a Viking or Banshee. As 2 Oracles plus a 3rd Stargate unit is very common of a Stargate openers in PvZ, we imagine it could easily be slotted in as the 3rd unit in Liu of a Phoenix or 3rd Oracle. As for implications in other matchups, in PvT Void Rays would notably gain the ability to chase down Banshees. We're never gonna see this. I'm willing to take a bet that we're not gonna see more than 3 Void Rays chase down Banshees in the next 6 months. There's absolutely no way. And in PvP, we've heard feedback that this new Void Ray could potentially be useful in proxy robotics defense. Might be true, might not be true, but maybe, yeah, could be possible. So this change is interesting. I think it could be used as a 3rd unit in PvZ, killing overlords, perhaps denying some creeps with the oracles, with the revelation. It might actually be a thing. It doesn't sound that bad. I really like this. Void Ray is largely useless. People will complain about it because mass Void Ray is very common at lower level, but this kind of change, because it's not changing the power of the Void Ray, but just the speed and slightly the cost, it won't really matter at low level, I think, very much. People will think they'll lose more to Void Rays, but that's just because the low level tosses will just start messing Void Rays more now that it got buffed. So we're going to see a lot of complaining about the Void Ray for no real reason. The Void Ray is actually one of the worst units in the entire game, and this buff was long overdue, honestly. Flux Veins. Movement speed increased from 4.65 to 5.11. I don't really care about this. That all seems fine. You can read it if you want, but who cares? Carrier. Interceptors belonging to a carrier that has been neural parasited will no longer draw aggression from units belonging to the carrier's original owner. Good for the late game for TOS. So you can't get triggered anymore. Though this interaction isn't as commonly seen these days, we'd like to bring it in line with what we believe is more congruent with how Neural Parasite interacts with other units in the game. I think that's fair. The final one is actually pretty cool. It's a new upgrade found on the Fleet Beacon, Tectonic Destabilizers. The effect improves the Tempest Resonance Coil to plus 40 damage versus structures. It's pretty cheap, 100 seconds research time, and it helps a lot against mainly Spore Crawlers. So it's very, very useful in that case against Spore Crawlers. It might have some use in like proxy Tempest situations as well, but honestly majority of the time we're not really gonna see that. So really it's just gonna be good against spores. So yeah, that's basically going to be all the patch notes for now. If you did enjoy this video, don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel, check out my other videos, and leave a thumbs up down below. That helps me a lot, and I'll see you all next time for a new video tomorrow, Harstem hour. Bye bye.